Thank you very much, Jonathan. Fellow colleagues, comrades in arms in counterterrorism, if I can use that term, dear friends, as the study of contemporary terrorism continues into its second half-century, I want to share with you some personal thoughts about the challenges that I think oblige us to reconceptualize how we view terrorism and therefore how we think about counterterrorism strategies. The many years of experience and research that are represented in this audience and the attendees at this conference, I think offer valuable perspective and insight into the issue of terrorism, but sometimes the coils of history can constrict our thinking. And as the threat evolves, we need to continuously reflect, review our assessments, and recalibrate our response. As many of you know, and I have worked in this field for more than 50 years. I tell people, give me another 50, I'll have it all sorted out. I was commissioned in the Army 10 years before that. During this time, I have witnessed firsthand the ebbs and flows of political violence and armed conflict, and I am convinced that we are presently navigating some different currents. I don't need to remind this audience that the threat continues. More than 30 Israelis have been killed this year in terrorist attacks. You know, sometimes we become so accustomed to carnage that we lose our perspective. We say 30, it's a small number. You know, if that were scaled up proportionately to the United States, where the population is 35 times that of Israel's, that would be more than 1,000 deaths. I mean, the alarm and anger are understandable. But the face of terrorism itself is changing. For the past 25 years, the threat posed by the jihadist terrorists has dominated much of the world's attention. The jihadists are still there, but currently, at the moment at least, they are scattered. They're under continuing pressure. Although jihadist fronts continue to operate in the Middle East, in Africa, in Asia, and indeed the most recent arrest of a homegrown jihadist allegedly planning attacks in the United States was just last month. So this continues. But beyond the jihadist threat, I think we confront a growing threat from a number of factors, including the violent edge of a broader social and political conflict. The fact is that democracies worldwide are on the defensive. The boundaries of terrorism are blurring. We see, in addition to terrorist organizations, we see what might be called untethered terrorists. Actors motivated as much by their personal problems as by ideology, competing with each other for body counts and status. There actually is a point system on the internet on this. These are mass murders with live streaming cameras. In my country, mass shootings are at an all-time high. Some people assert that all mass shootings should be considered acts of terrorism, regardless of whether the motives are personal or political. Ordinary people today seem to be on edge, quick to violence, a trend that preceded but certainly was exacerbated by the pandemic. Below the threshold of terrorism and ordinary crime, we are seeing a growing phenomenon of random social aggression, acts of violence that have no nexus to political ideologies or to traditional crime, but that simply fall in the realm of generalized thuggish behavior. At the other end of the spectrum, some organizations that originated decades ago as small groups have survived to become proto-states, and along the way have acquired or have been equipped with by others vast arsenals of rockets and advanced missiles, and more recently, drones, the effectiveness of which is being demonstrated in the war in Ukraine. The acquisitions of these trappings of statehood, however, have not been accompanied by any adherence to the traditional norms of state behavior. Hezbollah here is the prime example of that. Attitudes toward terrorism and counterterrorism are changing right now. In Europe and in the United States, terrorism has been eclipsed by great power competition. This makes it difficult to sustain vital counterterrorism intelligence efforts, operational capabilities, and supporting research programs. A return to Cold War cleavages, which we are seeing, will complicate international cooperation against terrorism. Many would argue that the post-9/11 campaign to degrade the operational capabilities of the group responsible to prevent further large-scale terrorist attacks and to contain homegrown jihadists have been, to a measure, indeed to a large measure, successful. And yet the war in Afghanistan ended in catastrophe, and actions in Syria, Libya, and Iraq have not fared much better. A revisionist history is being advanced. It portrays counterterrorism as a malevolent campaign that was created to target ethnic and religious minorities. Now look, if we are honest, we can identify prejudices, we can identify strategic errors, we can identify avoidable excesses, and in my view, some egregious abuses of authority. But these remind us that alarm and overreaction can corrode sometimes our commitment to the fundamental values which are a key part of our arsenal. But let me be clear, counterterrorism was not an evil enterprise. Unfortunately, the lesson some may learn is that counterterrorism should be avoided altogether. It's politically dangerous. It's dangerous to institutional survival. It's dangerous to individual careers. That takeaway itself would be dangerous. Old debates have reemerged. We face a new generation of people who would justify terrorist violence because it has noble objectives, arguing that the end justifies the means. We've been here before. The achievement, in fact, of the last quarter of the 20th century was to obtain a degree of consensus that terrorism was defined by the quality of the act, not the identity of the perpetrator or the nature of the cause. The principle, which was the foundation for international cooperation against terrorists, is again under challenge. Some suggest that terrorist violence is both ethical and responsible if it, for example, targets nations or corporations seen to be contributing to climate change that imperils humanity. Given some of the nightmare scenarios of global warming, the concept of omnicide. Genocide is killing a certain group of people omnicide is killing everybody. That omnicide, that is an effort, an appropriate ethical effort to prevent widespread suffering by deliberate self-extinction of human life on Earth, and that would be a humane course of action. Think of a global Masada. State terror and state-sponsored terrorism are certainly not new, they're still around, but the increasing role played by unacknowledged military formations, sponsored militias, mercenaries, and proxies takes armed conflict into a gray area where responsibility is harder to prove and rules are harder to enforce. This facilitates terrorist tactics. Iran's IRGC, a host of militia formations in Iraq and Syria, Russia's Little Green Men, the Wagner Group, and other private armies are examples. How to respond to these groups and their tactics is a growing challenge. Genocidal plots cannot be excluded. While thus far the world has avoided nuclear terrorism, the COVID pandemic reminds us that advances in science and technology could lead to the creation of dangerous, contagious pathogens that even target specific races or ethnic groups. Now, some on the internet are already promoting the conspiracy theory that the COVID virus itself was designed to kill whites or designed to kill blacks while sparing Jews and sparing Asians. To suggest that Jews and Asians are somehow the beneficiary of plague really fuels the more dangerous theory that Jews and Asians are the authors of this pandemic. Jews are in trouble anyway. They are seen by some of the right-wing white nationalists as being part of a plot to exterminate the white race. Now, we all know that terrorism can be a contentious topic, and I am aware that some of the things that I'm about to say may be controversial. But in my view, the most serious national security threat does not derive from terrorism in its traditional form. We can deal with the bombers, but it comes from the deep social and political divisions seen in both Israel and in the United States. The parallels between the two countries are extraordinary. Mutual respect in political discourse has been replaced by intimidation, by the demonization of political opponents, and by increasingly bellicose rhetoric. The terms treason and tyranny appear frequently. The political winds carry a whiff of violence. Many Israelis and Americans, indeed, according to the latest polls, a majority in both countries, worry that our countries are headed for civil war. If not civil war, then escalating turmoil with the real prospect of political violence. Now, addressing that situation is more difficult when the enemy is us. These domestic divisions pose a more insidious threat that perhaps cannot and probably should not be addressed through the narrower lens of traditional counterterrorism. Indeed, given the circumstances, in some cases, even the use of the term terrorism may be so emotive that it will exacerbate the situation and be counterproductive. In fact, Today's domestic political extremists seem less likely to resort to the traditional terrorist tactics in any systematic manner. There's no need. They have larger constituencies, they have access to sympathetic media, and they can even count on a measure of political support. At the same time, we have to recognize the limits of what counterterrorism can achieve. Counterterrorism cannot end prejudice. It can't strip mine bigotry from society. It can't end hatred. Counterterrorism cannot resolve religious differences. These are deeply embedded in society and must be addressed by the nation as a whole. Counterterrorism can establish the guardrails to enforce the law. It is not a solution to any nation's deeper problems. The fundamental challenge we faced in the 1970s and that we continue to face today is how to protect our societies against violence caused by the diffusion of destructive power to extremist states and extremist groups, as well as to individuals whose grievances, real or imagined, cannot always be satisfied. When that threat includes our own fellow citizens, the challenge is even greater. I saw that the motto of Reichman University is freedom and responsibility. These words apply equally to the field of counterterrorism. And the question is how? How, as democracies dedicated to being free and tolerant societies, we can deal with the fanatics, the irreconcilables, the would-be tyrants, and remain democracies is our continuing challenge. Thank you very much.